Okay, well, let me welcome you all to the second Carolyn and William Reeburgh lecture in global climate change. And I want to start by thanking Bill, who's here today, for establishing this lecture series. So for those of you who are new, Bill Reeburgh was a founding faculty member of the Earth System Science Department and played a crucial role in shaping the department and helping it become the #1 department in the world dedicated to global climate change, understanding both climate change and its consequences. His vision is that this lecture series will lubricate the interdisciplinarity and collegiality that characterizes the department and carry on the tradition. He wants to facilitate discovery, interpretation, and transmission of new knowledge, and the speaker series is going to play an important role in doing that, in bringing the latest research to our students, our alumni, and visitors. So thank you, Bill. I also want to call your attention to the Ralph J. and Carol M. Cicerone Endowed Chair and Fellowship Fund. So we have a $5 million goal for this fund, $2 million for the chair. And once again, for those of you who don't know about the internal sausage making of a university, a $2 million endowment generates $90,000 a year of discretionary income. So roughly the same amount of money as a normal sized National Science Foundation grant, with the neat proviso that you don't have to justify how you spend it to anybody. And so you can try wild and wacky ideas that might be slowed down by government panels and other sorts of interference. And then our other goal is to generate $3 million graduate fellowship fund, which each $1 million would generate $45,000 a year to help attract the best and brightest graduate students to the best department on global climate change in the world. So as you all know, ESS has quickly established itself. Even President Barack Obama, at his commencement speech last spring, commended the department for being the first in America to focus on global climate change. So although we are the best, we have to compete against schools like Harvard and Stanford that have much, much larger endowments. And this chair would double the number of chairs at UC Irvine devoted to global climate change. And once again, for those of you who are new, Ralph Cicerone is currently the the president of the National Academy of Sciences. He was a founding chair of the Earth System Science Department, and then he became the dean of physical sciences, and from 1998 to 2005, he was the chancellor here at UC Irvine. We've already generated $1 million towards our $5 million goal, largely due to contributions by Ralph and Carol, by John and Kingsley Crowell, and by the Jenkins family. So we're halfway to a chair, and if anybody is looking for a year-end deduction to help us on the next half, there will be pledge forms at the reception. And of course, Audrey Kelleher, I would be glad to talk to anybody. And also, if you happen to have any friends who you think might be interested. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael Prather, another founding faculty member of this illustrious department, and he'll introduce Dr. Victor and tell us a little bit about today's lecture.
Thank you. I have to be wired in order for this to be filmed. Thank you all. It's great to see the crowd. It's good to see you all. And thank you for the second Reeburgh lecture. Today we are pleased to have David Victor, who unfortunately volunteered in a moment of whether, who knows what, craziness or whatever, and when Steve Davis convinced him to come, and then Steve promptly left for Lima, Peru. So, but he's doing good work down there, we hear. David got his bachelor's degree at Harvard, We overlapped there. I was leaving as a postdoc while he was just learning how to do history of science. And it turns out he even worked with some of my old friends and colleagues who I was working with at the time for the classroom and TAing for them. You got your Ph.D. from MIT in political science and moved on into much more interesting things. Places like IASA, which is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in, I think it's in Vienna. South of Vienna, it's in town south of Vienna. A lot of old colleagues we work with there on IPCC, a lot of the scenario builders are there. It's sort of one of the major institutes for trying to understand future scenarios and emissions issues. You went to the Council on Foreign Relations, worked there as one of their senior science analysts, advisors, okay. And then went on to do a very interesting thing in pushing, we're going to hear about this today. For example, Global Warming Gridlock, a book in 2011, major reviews on it, very popular reviews by The Economist and whatever, and we're going to hear a bit about similar things on that today. The only thing for fun is that we actually have, I think I've counted 3 overlaps, okay? Number one is we actually were at Harvard together, which surprised me because although I spent a lot of time there, I didn't know anybody else was there. I was working in a small office as a postdoc. I was in a small office as a postdoc. I didn't know it then. I didn't know, we didn't see the rest of the university being, we were not privileged to be the undergraduates or the faculty at the time. The other one is that you actually, what's funny, we both did an aviation report. You wrote on liquid hydrogen for aviation at the time that I was running a NASA program on environmental effects of aviation. So I picked up that paper and said, oh, wow. And finally, your new work, which is interesting about ditching the 2-degree warming, which we'll hear about, I also am fed up with for various reasons, but totally different ones after working with IPCC, that I also agree with you entirely that the 2-degree warming level is just absurd for many reasons, much less what you have for them. There's so many other reasons why we should not have a threshold that we cannot cross. Anyhow, so today we'll hear from David Victor. What have we learned?
Great.
You're mic'd.
I'm mic'd already. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for those introductions. Thank you, Bill, for setting this up. It's really a pleasure to come and talk today about the global climate issue. I'm a political scientist by training, and I would venture to say that most of you are from the natural sciences and biological sciences in various ways. And I want to try and convince you today that there are ways of thinking about the problem scientifically, but politically, that are very important. This is a hard problem. This is the hardest problem in some sense that humanity has tried to address. Other problems have been existential, like global nuclear war, but because they're existential, people focus on them. Other problems, like the ozone problem, which is where Mike and I first met when you guys were flying the converted U-2 spy plane into the ozone hole. Those problems turned out to be easier to solve because we found alternative chemicals that didn't cost very much. And so suddenly you had an industrial coalition that wanted regulation, which is always wonderful. This problem's not like that. This problem's hard scientifically. This problem's hard politically, and I want to spend most of my time today talking about the political dimensions to this. I'm going to show you several slides and pictures from the newest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, so-called Working Group 3, for those of you who are steeped in the IPCC world. I was the convening lead author for the opening chapter of that report, and then wrote much of the summary for policymakers, which is the main document that comes out of this, that then is our statement as to what we know. Working Group 3 is about mitigation, controlling emissions, and a very large portion of it is actually now about the politics, or what we call the political economy, the interaction between politics and economics, the political economy of international cooperation. This is very new, it's very hard, and it's very particularly hard for governments to stomach the idea that scientists are going to go tell them about what they've actually been doing well and poorly. And that might help explain why many of our most important insights were actually cut from the summary for policymakers before it was published. And I'll show you some of the slides from that and help you understand why that might be. I'm going to give an upbeat talk. For the last 20 years, I've written various books and articles saying that most of the strategies we're following to address the climate change problem have been moronic and have been guaranteed to fail. Books like one of them that had the title Global Warming Gridlock, Collapse of the Kyoto Protocol. I think I have some track record of accuracy in those predictions. I am today more optimistic about the international negotiations than I have been for a long, long time. In part because some of the ideas I'll talk about today are now being incorporated into those negotiations and being organized in a way that's much more flexible, much more likely to get to meaningful agreement. And we see the green shoots of that already with what the European Union, which has always been a leader on this topic, what they've adopted is their new energy strategy, 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. And now, to a lesser degree, but a significant degree, in the joint US-China initiative. We're going to see something from India, I think, May, June. And so we're starting to see things happen. And things happen that are more than just window dressing. But before I tell you how awesome the world is, I want to just make sure that we take stock of where we've been so far. Because so far we have been extremely good at sending diplomats to meetings. And I'm glad to see Steve Davis is down joining all those diplomats in Lima, Peru. He would be better off here. Diplomatically, the event's a complete waste of time.
It's his first time, he has to do it once.
You have to do it once. And there's an experience. It's, it's like going to Burning Man or something like that. And, so he's there, and he's going to come back. And so far we've been very good at sending diplomats to meetings. We have not been very good at controlling emissions, and in fact, statistically, you simply do not see anywhere in the data the impact of any of these policies. Let me give you a sense, just without doing this statistically, but to give you an eyeball sense of this. This is a chart from the Global Carbon Project, which is a terrific group of folks who update on a fairly regular basis now monthly resolution data of emissions of the major greenhouse gases. This shows over time historical emissions with the solid lines here, and then various scenarios looking out into the future. Gives you a reminder that we have actually no idea what the future is going to look like. And what you see in the historical emissions, especially during this most recent decade or so, which is when you'd expect the impact of international negotiations to be having the biggest impact, in fact, emissions have been rising most rapidly during that period. And when you do a counterfactual analysis and you go look and say, what would have happened in all these different parts of the world absent these international agreements, which is hard to do because these are thought experiments, you see essentially no impact. The best case we could make is that the impact in Europe in particular has been maybe a couple 100 million tons a year. That sounds like a big number. That's about 3 weeks of growth in China. So we've kind of worked on this problem diplomatically for 22 years, and we've bought ourselves 3 weeks. So maybe that's not a completely awesome return on investment. It used to be a few years ago that our actual emissions were tracking higher than the highest conceivable scenario, which is shown here in the red. And one sign of progress is that we've actually upwardly revised the highest conceivable scenario so that now the emissions are tracking it perfectly. So there you go. That's progress for you. Just to give you a sense of where the growth is actually happening, this is a chart that was in the draft of the Summary for Policymakers and then removed for reasons that will become clear in just a moment. This breaks the world down. These are all countries here. This is the same data, emissions of greenhouse gas on the vertical axis over time. Historical emissions up to 2010, which is the last reliable year for all the gases. We've had more recent data, as I showed you in the last slide, for some of the gases, but not all the gases. These are global emissions and an estimate of the uncertainty. This is an area where the social scientists have improved a lot. We now know more about what we don't know, so our error bars have gone up a little bit over time. It's not a sign that we're becoming more stupid, although maybe that's happening as well, but it's that we understand better what's happening underneath the stones that we haven't turned over. Emissions from the advanced industrialized countries, the high-income countries, are flat basically and now poised to decline, not radically, but declining a little bit across the industrialized world, including in the United States. Emissions from the upper middle income countries are essentially the source of all the growth. And that's dominated by one country in particular, which is China, and the emissions related to coal from China. It's one of the reasons that I think China's behavior is the pivotal behavior to watch for Lima and for the meetings a year from Lima, so a year from now in Paris. And why the shift in the Chinese, what the Chinese are saying in public and their willingness to talk about commitments is a big deal. One of the reasons that we've had no impact from international negotiations on actual emissions is that we in the diplomatic community are extremely good at negotiating agreements that people can comply with. We're not very good at negotiating agreements that are actually relevant. So this gives you a sense, and this is an agreement, a treaty for which I have particular scorn, which is the Kyoto Protocol. Not scorn from the far right, because I think this is all conspiracy to keep academics employed and so on, but scorn because the Kyoto Protocol is an agreement designed to look like you're doing something about the problem, and in fact you're doing nothing about the problem. So the Kyoto Protocol was designed as what we call a top-down treaty. This is a treaty where negotiators get together, they agree on how to categorize the world into different buckets. The buckets were really sophisticated. the industrialized countries that should do something and everybody else who doesn't need to do anything. And then they listed the 38 industrialized countries in the back of the treaty on a piece of paper that's stapled to the back of the treaty, and gave a percentage emission cut basically for each of those individual countries. Sure, and those percentage emission cuts that are listed in the back of the treaty, those are percentage emission cuts that the countries themselves said they would sign up to. So they reflected what the countries knew they could do anyway. So for example, the Russians were thrilled with themselves that they agreed to freeze their emissions at 1990 levels. That was a major treaty commitment. And of course, their emissions actually were almost 30% lower than 1990 levels because the entire economy had collapsed thanks to the restructuring of the Soviet Union. When you look country by country, you see the same kind of picture. And so the actual formal level of compliance with the Kyoto Protocol to this day has been perfect. 100% of the countries comply with the Kyoto Protocol, and that's because they could nominate the commitments for which they were going to comply. Or we say in other language, the commitments in the institution are endogenous to what the countries would have done anyway. The United States, of course, famously did not join the Kyoto Protocol, and that reveals this general theory at work here, which is that US emissions were 15% higher than 1990 levels by the early 2000s when the United States faced the question of should we ratify the treaty. It didn't help that George W. Bush was in office as well and so on, but when we faced that question, there was no scenario by which we could ratify the treaty and actually comply, so we didn't join the treaty. And Canada, which joined the treaty, which signed and ratified the treaty, looked over the rear vision mirror and discovered its largest trading partner was not undertaking these obligations, so Canada actually withdrew. And so as a formal legal matter, we have 100% compliance with a treaty that has had 100% zero impact on actual behavior. And you might say, well, at least it got us going someplace in the right direction. And so that hypothesis is interesting, and you can look at that hypothesis with this chart here. This chart shows you the fraction of world emissions that were in that list at the back of the Kyoto Treaty when Kyoto was first negotiated back in the year 1997. 60% of world emissions. You say that's not 100%, but that's pretty significant. Then you look at the fraction of emissions that are covered by the countries that actually stayed in. So removing the United States and accounting for all the growth in emissions in the rest of the world during the intervening years, you end up with about a quarter. Then you look, the Kyoto Protocol was re-upped. It's a more sophisticated term than re-upping, but it was re-upped in the year 2011 at a meeting in Doha. And you look at the countries that actually stayed in the Kyoto Treaty after that re-upping process. So Japan, for example, which has always hated the Kyoto Protocol, but was only a member because they hosted the negotiations and it would look bad form to not join the treaty that you hosted. So they said, we're out of here, because it's now the Doha agreement, so we're gone. And you look at the fraction of world emissions covered then, and it's only 13%. So what you've got is a treaty structure, because it's top down, and because it's divided the world into these two buckets, that's squeezing water from a stone, the 13% of world emissions, and that fraction's declining because it's dominated by the EU, which is already regulating its emissions for reasons totally unrelated to international law. That is the state of play today. It is a truly catastrophic diplomatic performance for the last 22 years of effort, although we have seen a lot of cool places in the world as a result of that, and met a lot of friendly folks and given folks like Steve a chance to go see the Jamboree firsthand himself. Okay, how do we think about doing better in the future? And here's where I want to give you a sense of the current state of the science, and particularly the political science here. One of the pivotal questions is, what is a reasonable goal? Should we be aiming, as we have been for the last decade, at stopping global warming at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels? Or is there some other way to think about that problem? Goals are very, very important. And large, complex systems where nobody's in the driver's seat require goals in order to orient decentralized activity. The problem is that the 2-degree goal itself is not connected in any way to reality. Mike's got problems with it. There's a paper that he mentioned that Charlie Kennel and I put out in Nature in early October that raised a series of problems with this goal. Some of them related to the fact that measuring goals in terms of global average surface temperature is not a very good way of measuring the actual human stress on the planet, because global average surface temperature responds to lots of different factors, or as in the case of the last 16 years, doesn't respond to lots of different factors and so on. And it's not because we're not adding stress to the planet, it's because the stress is better measured in other places, like top of the atmosphere radiative imbalances, or we think that doing more with the Argo floats and ocean heat content would be a good idea, and so on. That's an important scientific debate that's underway right now. I want to focus on the other part of the problem with 2 degrees, which is that it is no longer achievable as a goal once the climate comes into equilibrium. One of the areas of tremendous advance in the social science around climate change is we are now developing much more sophisticated models that know information about the structure of the world economy, the technologies that would affect emissions, and the cost of installing new technologies in order to reduce those emissions over time. And I want to present you a couple slides that summarize all of that work and give you a sense of the scale of the problem. This is a chart, again, emissions of all greenhouse gases converted into common units. They're called carbon dioxide equivalents. You take methane and you multiply it by a factor and another one. It turns out to be actually not a very smart way to convert all the gases into common units because it's ignorant about some very important time horizon effects, but everybody does it, and so we keep doing it. And we raised some questions in the new IPCC report about whether this is a good idea, and the diplomats politely told us, thank you for that part of the report, and nothing will change. So we're just going to keep doing what everybody's doing, which is converting all these different gases into carbon dioxide equivalents. For the long haul, carbon dioxide is the problem, and so it's not an unreasonable approach to focus, at least for long-term emissions, on carbon dioxide. That's emissions on the vertical axis over time. These are historical data. This is that same spike we were talking about earlier. And then these are scenarios looking out into the future. These scenarios down here, the light blue scenarios, are ones that are consistent with having a significantly better than even chance of stopping global warming at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the year 2100. These scenarios up here, just to give you perspective, these scenarios here are the so-called business as usual scenarios. So these are if governments don't adopt lots of new policies, they kind of keep doing what they're doing, setting everything on fire, and then you end up with emissions out in that kind of world. The business as usual scenarios are consistent broadly with 3 or 4 degrees of warming by the year 2100. Some people think maybe it's 4 degrees. There's some significant error bars around that. So you've got these scenarios. These yellow ones here are a 50-50 chance of stopping warming at 2 degrees. You can see immediately that the job of getting from these scenarios down to these emissions, which are global reductions in emissions by 50% or more, which means if you assume that India is going to keep on growing, and I can guarantee you that India is going to keep on growing absent economic collapse in India, that China, although they've pledged to now stabilize emissions by 2030 and then gradually reduce them after that period, if you allow for growth in the parts of the world that are actually growing economically, that means countries like the United States, the EU, and so on having 80% or more reductions in emissions. Is unbelievable and extraordinarily difficult to achieve. We can look at this numerically and get a sense of what the costs are and so on, but the basic intuition from these modeling results is that maybe if we had started making significant global reductions in emissions way back here when diplomacy first began and the Kyoto Protocol was coming into force and so on, maybe we would have been in a position where we could actually bend the curve down in ways that would be consistent with 2 degrees. It is not possible with realistic assumptions to see that actually happen today. And I want to show you another slide in just a moment to give you a sense of some of the less than realistic assumptions that are nonetheless allowing us in the IPCC to say that it's possible to stop warming at 2 degrees. In fact, we're lying to you by saying that. It is not feasible to do that. Just to give you a sense of what the near term looks like, near term after the year 2030. You know, when I give talks to finance people, I say near term, they're looking for like the next couple of weeks. 2030 is near term in our world, as you know. These are the pledges that are on the books right now that were made after the Copenhagen meeting blew up in 2009. Another meeting the year after in Cancun allowed countries to make pledges. We expect to see the new pledges that are going to be made over the 4 or 5 months, the new pledges that governments are going to say, this is what we're going to do. We expect those to see those in line with the Cancun pledges, maybe a little more aggressive. The Cancun pledges are already in the upper range of these yellow scenarios, which have a less than even chance of stopping warming at 2 degrees, and they're way above every single one of the blue scenarios, except for some cool scenarios. It's very hard to see in this slide here. There's some scenarios that go up, the blue scenarios go up, and then the emissions drop like a rock starting in this period. And that's because if you tell the model that there's a miracle is going to occur and a set of technologies are going to become instantly available and cost effective around the world immediately or at the same time that allow you to grow biomass, which pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere, harvest the biomass without having emissions, some miracle occurs there, and you put it into power plants and generate electricity, and then you capture the carbon dioxide off the backside of the power plants and inject that underground. You do all of that with great reliability, and some moron pays for it. If all that happens, then the models don't need to make deep cuts in emissions right now because they wait until that technology is proved up. And these are optimization models. For those of you who worked in optimization models, you know that if you set up the model right, they'll love that kind of technology. All the models that allow for these deep reductions in emissions and consistent with stabilizing warming at 2 degrees have that kind of lovely optimization flavor to them. I want to just give you one slide on what to me is the most interesting part of this new research on emissions scenarios, which is until 6 or 7 years ago, the people who ran these models made the convenient assumption, and it's convenient because it's a way to start doing the job. It's a way when you wake up in the morning, then you can make some assumptions in your model and start getting results. They made the convenient assumption that the model will find least cost solutions within constraints of stopping warming at 2 degrees or whatever it is. The model will find those least cost solutions, that the opportunities for investing in emissions reductions are equal around the world, and that all players have perfect foresight and governments are perfect agents, and a variety of other assumptions that we make, which is not to disparage those assumptions. You have to get started. And so we got started on that problem. But we didn't pay attention to realistic assumptions, or so-called second best. This gives you some sense of the mindset, is that reality is called second best and optimality is called first best or least cost and so on. I call this life. And so the modeling community has now started to do a series of second best or nth best model runs, which is the area of this research that I would watch most closely. Let me just give you a snapshot of something that's interesting here. So here are scenarios centered on stabilizing concentrations of greenhouse gases around 450 parts per million. We're in the 400 range right now. This is consistent with a better than even chance of stopping warming at 2 degrees. And what we do here is the one is the reference point. This is the cost with optimal assumptions, perfect information, least cost computation, and so on. And then we tell the model some things that might change in the world that are different. So for example, low energy intensity technologies might become available at much lower cost than we expect right now. There's huge reductions in energy intensity already built in the models, but maybe something more would happen, okay? I want to draw your attention to these things here though. Suppose you tell the model that carbon capture and storage, for example, this bioenergy carbon capture and storage example I gave you before, which is called BECCS, B-E-C-C-S. Suppose that carbon capture and storage, including BECCS, is not available. What happens to costs? They go up by a factor of 3. Suppose you tell the model that bioenergy, and bioenergy plays a huge role in most of these models because the transport sector is one of the hardest sectors to reduce emissions from because oil is such an awesome competitor, right? So when oil comes under threat, the price goes down, it crushes the competition goes out of business, and OPEC and everybody's still there, and that's what's going to happen. Witness the backside of $60 oil. And oil has very high energy density and is a liquid at most temperatures, which is very convenient because it's very hard to have like a coal-fired airplane or a nuclear airplane or something like that. So it's an incredibly powerful fuel. If you can make liquid fuels out of bioenergy and have very low emissions, which is what the Brazilians are doing right now with sugar, and you can do a variety of other synthetic techniques, and synthetic biodiesel and so on, really exciting opportunities there, then you can have big reductions in emissions. And the models have been given a whole set of optimistic assumptions about that. If you remove those assumptions, then you see a big bump, kind of doubling of costs here. So far, nobody is mapping the space of second best assumptions where you have multiple assumptions connected to reality, called like real life, in the model at the same time. For example, every single model until a paper that a group in Maryland and I have been working on has made the assumption that investors can invest anywhere in the world at the same cost. And anybody who has experience doing business knows that different parts of the world have different costs. And so if you start telling the model about real risks of investment in different parts of the world, what's interesting is the model starts concentrating investment in lower risk places even though those might be the more expensive places at the margin to reduce emissions, because investors want to find lower risk and get assured return. You put all these things together, what you see is a picture where we can make the models deliver 2 degrees, but we can't make them deliver 2 degrees under realistic assumptions, and where the real cost of controlling emissions is probably going to be a lot higher than what we've been reporting in most of these studies, because we've been reporting these studies using basically only the least cost optimal scenarios. This is a very, very important area of research to look for in the future as we start to do a better job of modeling reality. I want to say a couple words about policy instruments and then close by talking a little bit about why I'm so optimistic. If you rewound the tape of history, and I think tape is actually the analogy, I'm sure today would be not tape, but when Mike and I were at Harvard together, if you rewound that tape back to that period in the Stone Age and pushed play, and you asked most analysts, I'm sorry to disparage our time together, but it was so long ago, and asked analysts, what's the best policy instrument to use? Yeah, paper tape, exactly. I wrote, I don't know how many people, I wrote my first program on punch cards. You mailed them in and you got a printout and so on. It's a different world. If you rewound the tape of history back to that period and you ask the analysts, what's the best policy instrument to use to address a problem, an externality like emissions of greenhouse gases caused by the energy system? And most of this problem is an energy problem, not entirely, it's agriculture as well. Energy is the gorilla here. The answer would be we should use markets. We should have taxes, or we should have cap and trade systems or something like that. And that's because we in the analyst community believe accurately that market instruments, because they're transparent and they're flexible, deliver lowest cost solutions. They create incentives for firms to go off and innovate and find the lowest cost way of doing things. That logic remains as impeccable today as it remained back then. There's been a lot of really interesting work comparing actually taxes and trading. The tenor of that work suggests, in my view, that actually taxes would be a much smarter strategy than trading because of the way taxes respond to uncertainty. And so there's kind of a lot of analytical enthusiasm about using market instruments and about using taxes in particular with properly recycled revenues. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A period more about that, which has been very exciting analytically. The problem is the politicians never got that memo. And the memo that the politicians got was that taxes and trading, because they're transparent and they make costs transparent, are the worst thing in the world you want to use. What you want to use is direct regulation, because you can force firms to do things and you can hide the costs. And in fact, most of politics is about basically shifting costs from well-organized political groups to less well-organized political groups like ratepayers and taxpayers and things like that. And regulation allows you to do that beautifully because nobody notices. And you see this, for example, in the case of California. We're a leader in reducing emissions. This is a study a little more than a year ago the California Air Resources Board, which manages this process, has done looking out to the year 2020, the level of emissions we need to have in California 2020 and the reductions from the expected level. And then they've broken out where do all the reductions come from. And to me what's interesting is that the cap and trade system we have here in California, which everyone's thrilled about, and it's significant, although the prices are still pretty low, $10, $12 a ton. The cap and trade system accounts for less than a quarter of the expected actual reductions. Almost all of the reductions are coming from direct regulation. And you look everywhere in the world, even places that have adopted market instruments like the European Union, which has an emissions trading scheme, the world's largest emissions trading program, and you look under the hood at what's actually driving reductions in emissions, it's almost always direct regulation. Why do I say that to this group? Because for those of you who are interested in studying the political economy of managing the climate problem, which ultimately requires looking inside countries and inside firms, I would watch the space around regulation, frankly, much more closely than the space around the market instruments. Because we have, in the analyst community, I think, misled people a little bit about the political feasibility of using market instruments as opposed to using regulation. And the different regulatory strategies and whether and how they converge around the world, I think, is going to be one of the most important topics going forward. Because of that, if you want to have success in an international negotiation on the climate problem, we have to recognize that lots of different countries are going to be using regulation, and the regulatory instruments they choose are going to vary by country. And so you cannot have a system that is inflexible, a la the Kyoto Protocol, this top-down set of targets, which forces everybody to look to the same common standards. You've got to have a system that has flexibility so that individual countries can tailor their commitments to their own individual situation. The most important reason why I am optimistic about the negotiations going on right now, not the particular ones going on in Lima, they're designed to make it look like we're going to get to the deadline and nothing's going to happen and it's going to be terrible and so on. That always happens at the interim meetings. But the ones going next year to Paris, the reason I'm much more optimistic about those now than I was in the run-up to Copenhagen is that the French government that's leading the Paris negotiations has explicitly adopted a strategy where the goal here is not a top-down treaty, but it's a kind of umbrella under which lots of different countries and groups of countries can then adopt individual measures and then stitch those measures together over time. It's actually the way the most successful, complicated international trade agreements have been negotiated and evolved over time, and we're going to do something similar in the case of climate change. One of the big challenges they will face is how do we deal with globalization? Globalization, on balance, has been very good for the climate problem because through globalization, we are able to move technologies around the world economy today much more rapidly than was the case in the past. And the best practice technologies move very, very quickly. You see this now with the big nuclear build-out program in China, which is basically taking maybe the right word, Westinghouse designs and other top flight designs and applying them, mimicking them, and scaling them up. When I travel, I like visiting power plants. It turns out my family isn't so excited about visiting power plants, so not always a family trip to go visit the latest refinery or power plant or whatever it is. When you visit power plants all around the world, you see the best nameplate technologies almost everywhere in the world on almost all new power plants. 20 years ago, you didn't see that. When you went to visit Indian power plants, you saw Indian nameplates. You went to visit Chinese power plants, you saw Chinese nameplates. It's a totally different situation today. And this globalization of the technology markets has made it possible to imagine relatively rapid, in the energy sense, diffusion of new technologies. It has, though, created one huge problem that we in the political science and the international legal, especially trade community, have been really grappling with and so far have not done a good job addressing. And that is because it is so easy to move finance and investment all around the world quickly, it is also easy to outsource your emissions. And in fact, the countries that have done the most on paper to control their emissions have principally done that by outsourcing. Look at Britain, for example, which is thrilled that it has a 30% reduction in emissions since 1990. They've done serious things in Britain. 20% of that reduction, though, so 1/3 of the reduction, comes from the fact that basically the high-emitting industries in Britain have moved out, and most of the energy-intensive activities have moved outside British territory, and so the territorial emissions from Britain have gone down. But if you rewrite the accounting rules to take into account consumption inside Britain, the achievement is much less grand. Here's another slide that also was removed from the IPCC a summary for policymakers because it touches one of the most sensitive political nerves, which is the implication that we cannot get serious about the climate problem unless we allow countries to go now and make adjustments to their borders so that we compensate for the differential cost of countries that are making a big effort in controlling their emissions, so the countries that aren't making a big effort in controlling their emissions, those products are differentiated at the borders. Because energy intensive and carbon intensive products are now moving around the world economy in ways that were unimagined 10, 15 years ago. For example, the Bay Bridge. Building a bridge is a very emission intensive activity. Huge sections of the Bay Bridge were built in Asia and moved by barge across the Pacific Ocean and then installed as the Bay Bridge. It's kind of a little more complicated than Legos, but that's the basic idea. And we have to find a way to deal with this. This chart gives you a sense. These are the high-income countries that I showed you before, the upper middle-income countries dominated by China. And the blue shows countries that are net importers of embodied emissions. So when you buy a ton of steel in the United States and it's made in China, the emissions right now get charged to China, if you like, even though they really should be charged to us because we're consuming the steel. And so there's a huge, and rising over time, the thickness of the line, the huge imbalance, basically trade in embodied emissions between the emerging manufacturing powerhouses and still the largest consuming economies. If we make border adjustments, and the EU has begun this a little bit with their aviation rules, if we make border adjustments, it will make the politics of international cooperation much easier to manage, because then suddenly countries are going to start to see the real costs of their emissions, and there won't be as strong an incentive to basically outsource emissions controls as there is right now. So I said at the top of my talk that I'm optimistic. Let me just show you a couple of snippets before I close as to why I'm optimistic. One, climate policy makers in most of the world are not talking about climate. They're attentive to climate, but they're mostly focusing on other things that are linked to climate that are frankly politically easier to manage. There's a terrific new book by a political scientist at Harvard named Steve Ensela-Behair that's done the best polling work on energy attitudes in the United States, and he's looked at trade-offs. Not just, you don't just ask people, do you care about global warming? Do you like the polar bears and other kind of nice things? They always say yes. Almost everybody says yes. You got to wonder about the person who says they don't like the polar bears, but people are always thrilled about these problems. And then you give them a series of tests where you have them do trade-offs that involve costing things. There's putting new technologies into place that are more expensive but have lower emissions. And the way they behave is the way you'd expect that they behave, and that we see in the polling data almost everywhere in the world, which is that people are willing to talk a good game about a problem like this, but they're not willing to spend very much. They are willing to spend more if they see the problem connected back to things that are more immediate. There's a big time inconsistency in the climate change problem where you spend money today to install new technologies and the benefits are diffused globally and in the future and are uncertain. As a general rule, we as societies aren't good at dealing with problems that have large time inconsistencies like that, especially if they involve complicated international cooperation with no border adjustments, and so there are active economic incentives to avoid regulation in this area. But if you link climate to other problems, energy security, I happen to be very interested in the links to air pollution because of all the evidence that ozone and especially soot are massive contributors to poor human health and to bad crop outcomes. I think the single most important reason why the Chinese have been much more optimistic about their ability to reduce emissions is not because they're worried about global climate. It's because you literally can see the air in Beijing and other Chinese cities. And when you go to cocktail parties and the casual conversation is about, well, which mask is the best mask to wear under this pollution circumstance, you know that things are wrong and you got to do something about the underlying problem. And for the most part, the solutions to the underlying problem correspond or have co-benefits with the climate issue. So here's a slide that shows you the relationship between, I'll focus over here right now, the relationship between policies that address black carbon and climate change. And there's a significant relationship because the model structure here, there's actually a lot of evidence that these models are massively understating this. But this analyzes the question, as you'd expect the IPCC would, from the point of view, if you have climate policy, what are the co-benefits in terms of pollution reduction? Most countries are thinking about the question the exact opposite way. If you're really doing something aggressive on pollution control in China or India or other places, what are the co-benefits for climate? We're talking a lot more about that, and that gives me much greater optimism. It's that kind of conversation that led to the US-China agreement. The second thing I'll say very briefly is that we're finding ways to work in small groups. This is a hard problem, and we have unwittingly made it much harder by putting all of it in the context of a UN-based negotiation where it is essentially politically impossible to discriminate against countries. Everybody has to sit around the table, which means that you've got 180 plus countries trying to find common agreement. And the common agreement in a negotiation with divergent interests on 180 players is the least common denominator. And when you try and take those big negotiations and move into smaller groups, somebody gets upset. So, Copenhagen. The final agreement in Copenhagen did not even, just as a matter of international law, legally acknowledge the existence of the Copenhagen Accord, which was the agreement that the small group, 30 countries, led by the United States and China and a few other developing countries, didn't formally recognize the existence of that Copenhagen Accord as the platform for further action. Because when that small group of 30, came to the larger group of 180 and said, here's our Copenhagen Accord, we need you to put it into the formal record, Sudan stood up and for 3 hours in the morning of December 11th lectured the world on respect for international law and procedure. And when Sudan is lecturing the world about respect for international law and procedure, you know something has come seriously unhinged. Luckily, the structure of the climate problem, and here's the last point I'll make before I stop. Luckily, the structure of the climate problem is such that a small number of countries can't solve it, but they can make a massive down payment. And that's what I'm showing you on this chart. This is a rank order plot. So biggest country in terms of emissions, for example, with the red line here, this is China, then the United States and so on. Rank order. CO2 emissions, 10 or 12 countries account for 70, 75% of world emissions. So you can make a hell of a deal with a small number of countries and then work, and it's easier to make a deal all else equal in a smaller setting because the transaction costs are lower. Work on that deal in that small group and then expand it out over time. R&D spending, which we think is very important because this is the supply or contributes to the supply of new technologies. R&D spending or patents, these are tri-country energy related patents from the OECD databases. Patents related to energy are even more concentrated, where 4 or 5 countries really dominate the scene here. This is what we're seeing right now. So I think when you add together the flexibility of these kind of bottom-up agreements, the umbrella that the French are organizing, the fact that for the countries that have been most reluctant to do something about the climate problem, China, I dare say the United States to some degree, are now focused much more on co-benefits and then bringing climate along with it. And the fact that we've now figured out ways of working in small groups, and the flexibility under this umbrella allows these small group agreements to be injected into the larger agreement and then stitched together over time. That's why I'm more optimistic this time around. This is, interestingly enough, very similar to the history of the creation of what today we call the World Trade Organization, where you start with a smaller group of countries that are more sympathetic to the underlying problem. You work in that group, you expand the commitments over time, you invite other members in through what's called the accession process. And I think it's been too long that we've worked on the big top-down global agreements and not thought strategically enough about the smaller bottom-up agreements. I'm encouraged, although diplomats have an infinite capacity to screw this one up, I am encouraged that we're now headed in that direction. I will say to close that this is going to be a long and slow process. 2 degrees is toast. The amount of warming we're committing to, even if this works, is significant. And that leads me as a political scientist to, I think, one of the most important insights that political science can offer to this problem, which is when you compare this with an optimal world, we as the planet are probably going to under-mitigate and therefore be forced to over-adapt. Because the mitigation problems, the coordination and collaboration and writing the legal agreements and enforcing them and so on is so hard, and we've also lost 22 years in doing this, is so hard that although we're going to get there, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be a lot of opposition. It's going to take a while to build the political interest groups that want deeper emissions cuts and so on. And those interest groups are the ones that really made the ozone layer accord so successful. And because that's such a slow process, we're seeing, as we expect, we're seeing a lot more attention to adaptation. And compared to the optimal scenario, I don't think anybody looking at this problem, if they were czar of the planet for not a day, but for a century, would mitigate to the least extent that we're doing and commit to adaptation to the extent that we're doing, but it is a structural byproduct of the way the politics are organized here. And with that, let me stop.
Thank you, David. Excellent. Questions? Difficult questions, especially.
Repeat the question before you answer it.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Heidi Hart. I'm a political scientist here at UC Irvine. I thought this was really interesting, especially the references back to the need for small groups, just because my research also looks at negotiations and especially informal practices within negotiations. And so I'm wondering if there had been any political efforts to do issue linkage and use actually the UN Security Council, which certainly there are arguments in the literature to link climate change back to the maintenance of international peace and security, which is the mandate of the United Nations. And there are already informal, backdoor diplomacy happening within that, within the Security Council. Has that idea been?
Yeah, so the question is whether there would be value in, I think, 2 things. One is linking the issue more firmly to security, and the other, because of that linkage, making greater use of the Security Council.
Right, there's only 5.
Right. So I think the answer to the first question is yes, and it's yes because as countries see this problem as a matter of national security, of course their willingness to pay to do something about the problem is going to rise. Now that's been true also as they see this as an air pollution or harming worker productivity and crops and so on. Security questions do command a huge amount of attention. My own view of the literature right now, speaking as a scientist, not as a marketing person, but as a scientist, my own view is that the literature linking this to security issues remains very, very weak. And the cause and effect relationships, so the impacts of climate on migration, the impacts of climate on civil war, the impacts of climate on food security, a little bit stronger. Some new work being done on voting behavior that's interesting. So you can start to see some signals in those studies, but there's a lot of other water stuff, but there's a lot of other signals going on. But I think that will change what countries are willing to do. My own view on Security Council, very briefly, is that Security Council is a very hard mechanism to actually get things done. And that's because you have in the permanent five, the P5, you've got one country that is now more willing to do things, but not to do it in a spotlight where you could imagine, UN people traipsing around the countryside and doing verification programs, namely China. And you've got one country Russia, which kind of wavers between either voting itself off the island because of its behavior and wanting a little bit of global warming. I mean, it's striking. Things are changing a little bit because of the permafrost evidence and so on, but it's striking the number of Russian scientists who have the ear of the government who believe, maybe not inaccurately, that in terms of market impacts on the country, a longer growing season would be better for timber output and for crops. And you got to remember that Russia is a carbon exporter. So this is about decarbonization, and so you should expect that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Russia and the other carbon exporters want us to fail. And it's not a surprise that when Mike and I go to these IPCC meetings, the most difficult country, hands down, is Saudi Arabia. They're super well organized and they want us to fail. So I'd be concerned about doing that through the Security Council because of those two veto options. Please, sir.
What would you say is the role of a more working group one oriented physical scientists and all this aside from being a font of information?
Well, being a font, the question is what's the role of the scientific community, working group one in particular in the IPCC. Well, being a font of information and accurate information remains incredibly important. I would say that what's happened, the role of the IPCC in all of this is to continue to demonstrate the scientific robustness of the underlying science, the robustness of the underlying science. Beyond that, I think this problem is increasingly a political problem and a governance problem. And there is some science in the governance area that could be reviewed in the IPCC mode, and we've tried in the Working Group 3 this time around. But because it wanders so much into the territory governments, I think it's very hard for the IPCC to actually deal with those realms of science. So my own view is that I would keep on making the case about the robustness of the science. I would learn about how to articulate that case in ways that are understandable by people who aren't scientists. And that is, I think, a tremendous challenge for all of us. And people who are very good at it are extraordinary because the average member of the public doesn't, on a daily basis, deal with words like perturbation. And we've got to find a way to communicate this. So I think that's maybe the most essential thing to do from the natural science community. Please, and then we'll look over there.
As a follow-on from that, I was wondering what you thought about how important public opinion is in driving the politics, and especially in the US, how important it is that one political party in particular is sort of almost standing against that science.
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. The question is how important is public opinion and political parties? And of course, the parties are increasingly not actually agents of the public opinion. And we've seen this incredible polarization. Our lab is just finishing a paper on lobbying activity related to foreign policy, where we've connected the lobbying dollars, tracked all the lobbying dollars, and then plotted them against the scores about partisanship. And really striking to see, especially for small groups and individuals, the incredible polarization in American politics is not unique to America. And there's some really interesting work suggesting that the underlying driver of this is actually income inequality. That in a highly unequal world, you create incentives. Campaign finance hasn't helped, and so you create incentives for people to go out to the extremes. My own view is that the public has to believe basically in the mission here. They don't need to understand all the details, and there's almost no area where they understand all the details. But you can't have a large swath of the public fundamentally oppose the mission. I don't think in the United States we're there. We have periods where it looks like we're there. So the polling data up until 2007 or so, when the economy started to crash, suggested across the board environmental issues that a significant majority of the public was there, with the caveat that they're not actually willing to spend very much on this problem. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance here, which is why the marketing of this, connecting the climate problem to other problems that are more immediate, is so important. But the real challenge here is that public opinion is highly fickle. So climate change rose near the top in unstructured questions the pollsters would ask before the financial crisis. Financial crisis came along, it fell off a cliff. The Macondo spill brought all environmental issues back, but then they disappeared again 2 months later. And this kind of waxing and waning of public opinion, I think, makes it very, very difficult to reliably know that the public's going to be supportive of this. I do think a lot of the problem lies with the Republican Party and the lack of discipline inside the party, that the kind of Teddy Roosevelt centrist Republicans are disappearing. And I'm not alone in that. There's a terrific book out of Brookings and some other places in Washington that's looked at this problem of bipartisanship and really pointed the finger more to the Republicans, but both to the dispersion of political opinion. Somebody was back there? Another question? Please.
So even those of us who consider ourselves somewhat liberal get tired of rules and regulations. So I'm wondering if you have any hope for market forces becoming important and helping us solve these problems, and fewer rules and regulations?
Look, I mean, as I've done this work on markets versus regulation, and actually wrote a paper calling it Potemkin markets, because what usually happens is that governments adopt both, and so they make it look like they're using markets, and then when you look behind the facade, you're actually seeing regulations doing all the work. That's the emissions trading scheme in Europe right now. The prices of credits in Europe are so low that they're irrelevant to actual investment and dispatch decisions for power plants. But the renewable power standards and feed-in tariffs and energy efficiency mandates, and all of that's really, really important. So I've been kind of horrified by where I ended up as a scientist in this, just observing reality, because it's contrary to everything that I've been taught. My view is that our great hope in using markets more is by using the markets to connect different regulated systems. So you create an opt-in right, basically. So you adopt a set of regulations that affect some industry, and then you create a market mechanism that allows the industry or some firms to opt in and then connect to other industries for trading emission credits and reductions. This is actually the way a lot of water markets function, where you've got a kind of dysfunctional status quo allocation of water rights, and then you have these marginal water markets that emerge around, and the kind of second best markets. That's actually working reasonably well. And that'll be very important, I think, as countries try to link their own individual national schemes, is using markets in that second best way. I'm also very encouraged, but more as a wonk than as somebody living on the real planet, by the tax-based strategies, in particular by using the revenues from taxes to do other fiscal reforms. Because if you get the other fiscal reforms right, you can reduce distortionary taxes in the economy with the revenues you're getting from a carbon tax. And then you actually generate economic growth and jobs and so on. And it's really powerful in its potential. I would say we have a tiny fraction of the corporate world behind this, none of the environmental community, and a bunch of people living in universities. So that's not a winning coalition yet, but we'll make some progress. Please, sir.
Some of the things I've been reading would seem to indicate that there's a growing group of people, institutions, perspectives that say, we'll adapt to it. That, you know, the scenarios are being painted up there. 2 degrees is already by the board, talking 3, talking 4. But nothing really seems to be desperately occurring in our lives. The ice is thinning, there's less ice pack, and chunks are breaking off in Antarctica and so on. Do you, in your sensitivities, perceive a larger population as just kind of saying, well, you know, that's the way it is, and we're going to adapt. We've adapted for hundreds of thousands of years. We'll do it some more and do it again.
So the question is whether the population thinks we can just adapt to this, and whether maybe that actually takes the air out of political efforts to deal to concerns about mitigation. I think, first of all, the vast majority of the population isn't thinking about this question in that many steps down the decision tree. They know there's an issue of climate change. Their attitudes about climate change appear to be driven by other priors, ideology, belief in the state, trust in institutions, and things like that. And then they basically form their attitudes about climate policy from that, as opposed to knowing about the science. So keep at your work in the back row there, telling people about this. My own view is that when we start to get serious about adaptation, that people are going to be horrified by what adaptation really means. Not so much because of cost. These are rich, or at least some countries are very rich and very capable, and if they think about this in a smart way, they'll be able to afford it. But because of the choices that are going to be required about unmanaged ecosystems. Highly managed, expensive capital assets we will protect. New York, we will not let go. Miami, for better or for worse, we will not let go. We'll defend it. Yeah, we'll defend it. We'll build, I mean, the Dutch strategy, you know, you think about the problem, you go further out in the ocean, you actually generate oceanfront property. So you actually, so we'll adopt engineering solutions like this great McPhee book, the Humans' Intervention in the Environment, or whatever it's titled, something like. There's a phenomenal book about large engineering systems like the Atchafalaya Dam, where we, for a reason, we go to spend a ton of money on some problem. The poorer societies won't have that option, and there'll be abandonments and a lot of pain and suffering, and unmanaged natural ecosystems, because their solution, their strategy for adaptation is not the human strategy of looking forward and being strategic and adapting. Their strategy is Darwinian, so you have extinction and so on. I think people are going to be horrified by that in the way that Bill McKibben's book, and Bill and I disagree on a lot of things, but I thought his book on the end of nature a long time ago, which is a terrific book about the idea that there's now, because of global mixing of gases, there's no place where you can go on the planet to actually see nature. And what we do know is that by 2050 and 2100, societies are going to be dramatically richer than they are today. And when people get, or at least many societies are, and when you imagine a world where people's preferences are driven by being hyper-rich and hyper-capable, they value amenities, in particular nature, at a much, much higher grade. So I think actually that's the part, we're going to have to go through some adaptation, and there's going to be a swing back.
Yeah, it seems that this is the game of the bigger countries. And then what is the role of the minority countries in terms of economy? Are they really important in this game?
The mitigation business is a business of big countries. That's geoeconomics. This is a big country game. It's not a game that can ignore the small countries because of concerns that the big countries are going to have about economic competitiveness. So a great example playing out right now concerns Vietnam and Cambodia, really Vietnam. The Chinese will be wary about adopting policies that are so expensive that they affect Chinese competitiveness when they see other Asian tigers attracting investment. So you need some strategy that starts with the big countries and then brings the other folks along, kind of through enticements or through bludgeoning them into compliance. But that's life. I mean, that is the life of getting serious about geopolitics. The small countries are going to be, and poor countries in particular, big and small, are going to be very relevant to this adaptation issue. And we have no strategy. We're talking about adaptation, we're setting up funds, I mean, not vast quantities of money right now, a few $1 billion, but I mean, a few $1 billion can buy some stuff, and we don't know how to spend it, because we don't know what kinds of interventions actually make the most sense and how outsiders can help intervene in a society to help the society do something that, when done well, is actually done through the DNA of the society. It's the whole adaptiveness of the institutions and so on. Maybe one last question if there is one, otherwise.
Thank you all very much.